Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for ETR's second ever Macro Views webinar. Last quarter, we broke the Macro Views survey findings out of the Technology Spending Intention Survey webinar for the first time, giving it the time and focus it deserves as a standalone research deliverable. But the Macro Views data has a pretty robust history here at ETR. This is the 13th consecutive quarter over the past 3 years that we've captured macro data, having started the Macro Views drill down survey to quickly capture impacts brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. The survey's grown in depth and coverage over the years, mostly through client demand, and also as our analyst team picks out new social, economic, and political trends impacting the enterprise IT landscape that bubble up in our hundreds of ETR Insights interviews with IT decision makers. So if you have something you'd love to see covered in future surveys, please reach out to us. In addition to this webinar, there's a full data findings report available and a comprehensive qualitative report that compiles feedback from ETR's expert IT decision maker community. My name is Darren Brabham, and I'm joined here today with my ETR research analyst colleagues Eric Bradley and Jake Fabrizio, who'll be joining at different portions of the webinar later on. So now, without further ado, let's dive into this Macro Views data. So the high-level summary here is that the economic environment is not pretty, but you probably already knew that from the news. Overall, IT spending has been revised downward across the board, and early estimates for 2023 don't look much more optimistic either. Still, there is some growth for IT spending overall, and some industry sectors, enterprise types, and geographic regions have more optimistic outlooks than others. Eric is going to give greater attention to these figures in his section. As for IT spending priorities, cybersecurity is still on the top of the list for most organizations. Consolidation and tool rationalization remains a popular choice for budget belt tightening too, and more organizations plan to move their workloads to the cloud. Jake will dive into greater depth on these topics in his section. Then I'll come back and add more color to the rather bleak hiring landscape and reveal what might be the few silver linings there in that section later. And lastly, Eric will look at vendor procurement life cycles and dig into which particular vendors and products might be taking the biggest hits as some organizations cut spending based on crossover data with our Technology Spending Intention Survey. But briefly first, a look at the composition of our survey takers in this round of the Macro Views. In this survey, which runs in conjunction with the quarterly Technology Spending Intention Survey, we had 1,314 total respondents, with more than 200 coming from the Fortune 500 organizations and more than 300 from the Global 2000s. More than a quarter of respondents hold C-suite titles like CIO or CTO, and just over half hold VP or director level titles. Most respondents, 79%, are from North America, and most, 66%, are from large enterprises. The IT, telco, services and consulting, and financials and insurance industry sectors collectively make up 47%, or nearly half, of respondents in this survey. Now let's turn to Eric to talk about overall IT spending plans.
The silky smooth stylings of Dr. Brabham, everyone. Thank you for the intro, Darren. And now we kick off the data analysis with an overall look at IT spending trends. And there is no reason to bury the lead here. The data clearly shows that IT budgets are coming down and coming down fast. We began the year with calendar year 2022 budget growth expectations of 7%, and now we end the year with updated expectations of 5.3% across all survey respondents. Looking at just the second half of 2022, survey respondents stated that Q3 spend was just 3.8%, and that Q4 will come in at 4.1%. In our forecast for 2023, full year budgets stand at a 5.6% increase, which is certainly behind banner expansion years like we recently lived through, but still represents growth expectations, albeit ones that can't even keep pace with current CPI. Speaking of inflation, we had one recent ETR Insights guest disagree with these budget expectations, stating, "That number is way too low. That is just inflation right there. I think people are looking at the numbers and seeing 6 or 7% in cash value, but they're not thinking of value plus inflation. 7% inflation is what we're expecting this year. So even if you spent the exact same value as you spent your last year, you're going to be spending 7% more. So in all likelihood, there's going to be 12 to 15% increase for most people. You're just going to end up spending more. And with inflation, it's going to double down." My colleagues are telling me I went over my allotted time on that last slide, so I will make this one quick. In this data visualization, we look at which survey respondent subsamples are planning to revise down their spending for the remainder of the year. And the punchline is that it's every one of them, with spending intent down across all enterprise size, industry vertical, and regional subsamples. However, mid-sized firms, energy utilities, healthcare pharmaceutical companies, and the EMEA region are all showing the steepest declines. In this slide, we break down anticipated 2023 budgets by enterprise size, industry vertical, and region. And the data illustrates some disparities. First, it appears that the smaller your organization, the more you intend to spend. Whether it's a situation of still playing catch-up or simply being more nimble, small and mid-sized organizations show more optimistic spending estimates for next year than large enterprises, as depicted here by their Global 2000 and Fortune 500 counterparts. By industry vertical, we see that retail consumer leads the way with a 7% budget forecast for 2023. And surprisingly, the normally conservative energy utilities sector also shows more optimism in their 2023 plans, hovering just below that 7% mark. Inversely, healthcare and pharma companies appear to be tightening their belt more than most. However, past ITDM commentary suggests the possibility that the pandemic pulled forward digital transformation spending for this sector more so than anticipated. Lastly, by region, Asia-Pacific organizations leads IT spending expectations, with EMEA falling behind. And now I will hand it off to my colleague Jake to dive deeper into spending priorities.
Consolidation of redundant vendors across business units remains the most common method for IT decision makers to achieve an anticipated decline in 2022 quarter 4 spending versus 2021 quarter 4 IT spending. Reduction of excess cloud resources, reduction of workflows and consumption-based tools and services, and optimization of SaaS licensing were all slightly more prominently cited than 3 months ago. Common write-in responses include a reduction in staffing or slowed hiring, cuts and delays to equipment purchases, and reduced reliance on IT consulting and managed service providers. IT decision makers that we interviewed are increasingly turning to cutting excess cloud resources and controlling cloud costs as a way to trim the budget. They describe these control measures as a push and pull. To tighten the belt, they're looking at their environment to see where spend can be reined in, whether it's a sandbox somebody spun up and never used, excess data storage, or making the decision to consolidate onto a single cloud vendor. Several IT decision makers describe top-down mandates for them to participate in consolidation activities, trimming zombie accounts, and looking for areas where redundant spend has crept in. Overall, vendor consolidation can support both IT and the business. Aside from cutting costs and keeping the CFO happy, as the CTO and Chief Data Officer for a mid-sized insurance company put it, consolidation can improve governance and security on these accounts and standardize functions across the enterprise. IT decision makers say that cybersecurity remains the top technological priority over the next 12 months. Analytics data warehousing is seeing a notable uptick in average ranking, bringing it to the second highest priority, while cloud migration and collaboration and productivity remain highly ranked as well. Machine learning and artificial intelligence is down after a slight bump 3 months ago and back in line with data from March 2022. In ETR Insights interviews, IT decision makers expect cybersecurity to remain a leading driver of IT spending. The Senior Director of IT Strategy and Transformation for a large consumer enterprise stressed how a strong security framework is critical for organizations to succeed. He said, quote, "Without cybersecurity, or InfoSec as a whole, organizations would not be able to function. Without a strong security framework and continued investment, I don't think you have many organizations standing after they get attacked or have some sort of bad actor after their data. Beyond security, IT decision makers were especially keen to discuss analytics and ML AI as investment priorities, and several noted them as top organizational areas of focus going forward. The head of operations for a large tech company noted that even the most data-driven organizations have room for improvement in these areas. She said, quote, "Good data is always the basis for good decisions. So we want to make sure that we increase our diligence there and make sure that the efficacy is there too for analytics. The same with machine learning and AI. I think we're still scratching the surface there with how we can leverage it into our products and how we can make sure that we use it appropriately and responsibly." Despite efforts to keep costs under control, many organizations will also continue to make significant investments into cloud migrations. Collaboration and productivity spend will also continue. Their spending has waned as these technologies are well penetrated and have matured in the enterprise. Respondents indicate that an average of 27% of their company's workloads are currently on an infrastructure as a service or platform as a service platform currently. Respondents anticipate a materially higher portion of their company's workloads will be on an IaaS or PaaS platform in 1 year and 3 years at 36% and 49% respectively. IT decision makers continue to put their dollars towards cloud and cloud migrations, but many have noted that they are starting to reach levels of maturity and beginning to optimize their spending here. Despite this, investments are ongoing and will continue as organizations continue to scale and expand workloads in the cloud, and as other organizations that are farther behind in digital transformation continue to adopt more cloud alternatives.
Thanks, Jake. Our macro views survey questions consistently ask about organizational changes, such as hiring trends, remote work, and IT skills and wages. On this slide, we see continued downward sliding on plans to accelerate new IT deployments or projects in the next 6 months. The number has dropped from 36% to 32% and now to 25% over the past 3 surveys. Likewise, plans to freeze new IT deployments and projects altogether have gone up from 6% in March 2022, then to 9% 3 months ago, and now to 14%. And this lines up with general IT spending trends we're seeing as organizations are pressing the pause button on new projects for the time being. Hiring is down again too. Plans to increase hiring have dropped rather sharply, now down to 35%. This number was a healthy 50% just 6 months ago. Likewise, hiring freezes have grown rather sharply too. Now, 23% of organizations indicate plans to freeze hiring in the next 6 months, compared to just 6% who said this back in March. If there is a bright spot in this gloomy hiring news, it is perhaps that plans to lay off employees have stabilized at 5%. IT decision makers are doing their best to figure out how to get more out of their employees or achieve scale and automation with a smaller staff. In a recent ETR Insights interview, a VP and manager of data analytics for a large financials enterprise has taken to exploring robotic process automation, or RPA, as a way to do more with less. He said, quote, "Let's invest more in this because that's replacing the bodies that we need to throw at it, and it's more productive." ETR has tracked the data on work from home changes consistently since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out a few years ago. In that longitudinal data set, we're definitely seeing some steady numbers now with little change for a while. What we're seeing is that organizations say about 37-38% of their workforce currently are and will remain permanently in a hybrid work arrangement. Currently, respondents say that 29% of their workforce is fully in office, and there's an anticipation that this number may climb a bit to about 32% in the long term. In the inverse, respondents say about 34% of their workforce is fully remote today, and they anticipate that number may creep down to about 30% in the long term. But what's interesting to note is that each time we've asked this question in the past few surveys, the estimate of how many people will fully return to the office gently drifts downward, and the estimate of how many people will be fully remote drifts slightly upward. So for instance, 3 months ago when we asked this question, respondents thought 27% would be fully remote permanently, and now that's up to 30%. And 3 months ago, they thought 35% would be fully in office permanently, but today that estimate is 32%. Nonetheless, the data on this question have stabilized quite a bit, and this pattern with hybrid work leading the way seems to be holding. In a recent ETR Insights interview, one CTO for a global retail and consumer enterprise says his organization just calls this kind of remote and hybrid work, quote, smart working, which is just about finding the right balance and situation that works for the individual and the organization. It's the norm now and the standard for the future, he thinks. Hiring may be slowing down, but our IT decision makers say wages will grow. The majority of respondents, 71%, say the median wage for their existing IT department employees will increase in the next 6 months, albeit most of these responses anticipate modest raises of 1 to 5%. A quarter of respondents anticipate more substantial wage growth north of 6% for existing employees, while 40% see this higher level of wage growth for new hires. Just 8% of respondents think they will decrease the median wage for existing employees in the next 6 months, and just 6% think there will be any kind of a decrease for new hires. Finding and retaining strong IT talent remains top of mind for IT decision makers, and salary plays a significant role in the pursuit of great people. In a recent ETR Insights interview, one senior strategy leader noted that, quote, competition is really, really tough, unquote. He said, quote, it's hard to find good talent. The market is really tough, very competitive. Now on to Eric to talk vendor procurement cycles and specific vendor trends. Eric.
Thank you kindly, Darren. We have one more data slide here before we dig into some vendor-specific analysis. And the impetus for this question being inputted into our macro survey was commentary from several public software companies stating that they were seeing elongated sales cycles during last quarter's conference calls. Those comments piqued our interest, so we decided to ask our ITDM community if they believed that their procurement process for software solutions was changing. What we found out was that most respondents felt as if there was no change at all to their procurement process, with 45% of respondents falling into that bucket. However, of those respondents that did indicate a change, it skewed heavily towards an elongated cycle, with 29% offering this insight versus only 12% expecting a shorter process. Okay, this part is really cool. Based on repeat client questions during our last macro survey, ETR's analytics team put together this analysis. The question this analysis seeks to answer is, if an ITDM was planning to cut spending, where would those spend cuts flow? And which vendors might be impacted in that scenario? Or more simply put, the purpose of this analysis is to see what vendors are impacted most if budgets were forced downwards. The chart depicts two net scores for the vendors listed. One, a net score rating from respondents with flat or positive spending in blue, and two, a net score for respondents with negative spending in red. Right away, we see multiple Microsoft product lines jump out as having significantly lower net scores among the negative respondent group, although it is not surprising to see such a ubiquitous tech provider show up on the screen. Seeing Salesforce show up is also notable, and several information security vendors like Okta, Qualys, and the recently acquired KnowBe4 were also screened as particularly sensitive to declining spend intents. In this slide, we rerun the analysis for vendors with lower total citation numbers, meaning you won't see the likes of Microsoft and Salesforce on this screen. Instead, we see several more information security vendors, such as Okta's Auth0, SailPoint, and private darling Wiz, as potentially exposed to negative spending trends. On the software app side, we see SuccessFactors, Twilio, and Coupa also exhibiting weaker net scores among respondents with negative Q4 spending intentions. And now I'll hand the mic back to Jake to wrap us up.
That's a wrap on ETR's October 2022 Macro Views Findings webinar. Before we close out, please be on the lookout for an email this afternoon with the full data report and the accompanying qualitative report highlighting feedback on our macro data from the survey takers and IT practitioners themselves. This email will be released following the webinar at 2:15 p.m. Eastern today. In the meantime, please feel free to reach out to us at service@etr.ai for feedback and suggestions. And don't forget, the entire ETR research and service teams will be back at it next week with our full October 2022 spending intention survey, where we will release our highest and lowest rated vendor-specific data sets and release 50 plus vendor-specific data reports. Mark your calendars. You don't want to miss it. Until then, be safe and see you next week.